My mother called me in the morning to tell me I should divorce my husband so he could marry my sister, because they'd make a better couple. My mother called me Tuesday morning to tell me I should divorce my husband so he could marry my sister, because they'd make a better couple. She said it like she was telling me about a recipe she found online. Listen, Victoria and James were talking at dinner last night about their research and they just clicked. You could see it. Two brilliant minds. You should step aside gracefully. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, watching my 3-year-old daughter eat breakfast. Mom, James is my husband. We have a child. Children adapt. And honestly, you'd be doing everyone a favor. Victoria needs someone who understands her career, and James needs an intellectual equal. Intellectual equal. I have a master's in education. I teach 4th grade, but apparently that doesn't count. Are you seriously asking me to divorce my husband so my sister can have him? I'm suggesting you think about what's best for everyone. Victoria and James could change the world together. They're both cardiovascular surgeons, published researchers, the conversations they could have, the children they could produce. We already produced a child, your granddaughter. Remember Sophie? Of course I remember Sophie. Don't be snippy. But imagine the genetic potential if Victoria and James had children. 2 surgeons, that intelligence, that drive. I can't believe you're saying this. Someone has to. You've been holding James back for 5 years. He could have been chief of surgery by now if he didn't have to rush home for your little teacher conferences and school plays. Those are his daughter's school plays. You know what I mean. He's limited by domestic obligations. Victoria wouldn't limit him. She understands the demands of medicine. Because she has no life outside the hospital. She has a very full life. She saves lives every day. What do? Teach kids to color inside the lines? That's when I hung up. She called back immediately. I didn't answer. Then Victoria called. Mom says you hung up on her. Mom suggested I divorce James so you can marry him. Silence. Then, would that really be so terrible? Are you insane? I'm practical. James and I have more in common than you two ever did. We speak the same language, work the same hours, understand the same pressures. You want me to hand over my husband like he's a sweater you borrowed? I'm saying maybe Mom has a point. You married him when he was a resident. You didn't know he'd become this brilliant surgeon. You thought you were getting someone who'd have normal hours, be home for dinner. I married him because I loved him. She sighed like I was a child. You'll never understand. When we operated together last week, it was like dancing. Perfect synchronization. He said he'd never worked with someone so talented. You operated on a patient together. You didn't discover true love. Mom's already talked to her lawyer friend about divorce proceedings. She says if you file first, you can get better terms. Mom talked to a lawyer about my marriage. She's being practical. Someone has to be. I drove to my mother's house with Sophie. She was in her garden acting like nothing had happened. Oh good, you're here. Can you watch Sophie next weekend? Victoria and James have a conference in Boston. They're going to a conference together? It's a cardiac surgery symposium. They're both presenting. Separate papers, but still. The networking opportunities alone. Mom, James isn't going to any conference I would know. She paused in her pruning. He hasn't told you? He registered last month? My chest went cold. I called James. Are you going to Boston next weekend? Silence. How did you find out? So it's true? You're going to a conference with Victoria? We're not going together. We're both going. Different thing. Did you plan to tell me? I knew you'd overreact. Overreact? My mother is trying to arrange our divorce so you can marry my sister. What? That's insane. Is it? You're sneaking off to conferences together. I'm not sneaking. I'm attending a professional event where Victoria happens to also be presenting. Mom says you two were clicking over surgery talk at dinner. We discussed a case. That's what surgeons do. Victoria says you called her talented. Said you'd never worked with someone like her. More silence. It was a complicated procedure. She's skilled. That's all I meant. James, I need you to be honest. Do you want to be with my sister? No, he said. I hung up and set the phone down on the counter. Sophie looked up from her cereal and asked if Daddy was coming home soon. I told her yes and tried to smile, but my hands were shaking. The way James said that no kept playing in my head. The pause before he answered. The way his voice got higher when he said my sister was skilled. Something felt wrong in my chest, like I couldn't get enough air. I sat down at the table across from Sophie and watched her eat. She had milk on her chin and was humming a song from the school. Everything looked normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. I kept thinking about what my mother said. About James and my sister clicking over dinner. About them going to Boston together. About my sister saying it wouldn't be so terrible if I stepped aside. I picked up my phone again and stared at it. I wanted to call James back and demand better answers, but I didn't know what to say. Sophie finished her cereal and asked if we could go to the park. I told her maybe later and helped her wash her hands. My mind kept spinning through everything that had happened in the last hour. My mother calling to suggest I divorce my husband. My sister acting like it was a reasonable idea. James hiding a conference trip from me. All of it felt like I'd woken up in someone else's life. James came home at 2 in the afternoon. He never comes home early. Never. His shifts at the hospital run 12 hours minimum, sometimes longer when there's an emergency surgery. I was in the living room with Sophie when I heard his car in the driveway. My stomach dropped. He walked in still wearing his scrubs and asked if we could talk. I told Sophie to go play in her room and she ran off with her dolls. James sat down at the kitchen table and I sat across from him. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes and his hair was messy like he'd been running his hands through it. He started talking about the Boston conference, saying it was purely professional, that all the top cardiovascular surgeons would be there. He explained that he'd been working on his research paper for months, and this was a huge opportunity to present it, but he wouldn't look at me. He kept staring at his hands on the table, picking at his thumbnail. I asked him why he didn't tell me about it. He said he knew I'd overreact, which made my face get hot. I asked him how long he'd known about it. He said he registered 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks. He'd kept this secret for 6 weeks while I planned our weekends and talked about maybe taking a family trip in the spring. I asked him if my sister registered at the same time. He finally looked up at me and his jaw was tight. He said he didn't know when she registered, that they didn't coordinate their schedules. But the way he said it sounded wrong, like he was reading from a script he'd practiced. I waited until Sophie was asleep that night before I called Alyssa. She answered on the second ring and I started crying before I could even explain what happened. She said she was coming over and hung up. 20 minutes later, she was at my door with a bottle of wine and her serious face. We've been friends since we started teaching together 6 years ago, back when I was pregnant with Sophie and she was planning her wedding. She knows everything about my life, about my family, about how my mother always made me feel small compared to my sister. I told her about the phone call from my mother, about my sister saying maybe it wouldn't be so terrible, about James hiding the Boston trip. Alyssa's face got red while I talked. She kept saying things like, "Are you kidding me?" and "That's insane," and pacing around my kitchen. She said my mother was out of her mind, that you don't just suggest someone divorce their husband so your other daughter can have him. She said my sister was acting like James was a prize at a fair instead of a married man with a child. She poured us both wine and sat down next to me on the couch. She asked what James said when I confronted him. I told her about him coming home early, about how he wouldn't look at me, about the 6 weeks of lying. Alyssa grabbed my hand and said we needed to call Nathan. Nathan showed up 30 minutes later looking concerned. He's a family therapist and he's good at staying calm when everyone else is freaking out. Alyssa must have told him some of it on the phone because he sat down and immediately asked me to walk him through exactly what my mother said. I repeated the whole conversation, about genetic potential and intellectual equals, and how I was holding James back. Nathan listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a minute. Then he said my mother was displaying classic narcissistic manipulation tactics. He explained that she was trying to control everyone by pitting family members against each other, that she was devaluing my accomplishments to make me doubt myself. He said the way she talked about genetic potential and optimal life paths showed she saw people as objects to arrange rather than humans with their own feelings and choices. He asked about my childhood, and I told him how my mother always compared me to my sister, always made it clear that my sister was the successful one while I was just the teacher. Nathan nodded like he'd heard the story before. He said my mother had probably been doing this my whole life, and I'd just gotten used to it, but now she'd pushed it too far, and I could finally see the pattern. Alyssa squeezed my hand. Nathan said I needed to document everything and set clear boundaries, that people like my mother don't stop unless you force them to stop. The next morning after James left for the hospital, I stood in his office staring at his laptop. I'd never looked through his stuff before, not once in 5 years of marriage. I trusted him completely, but my hands were already reaching for the laptop before I could talk myself out of it. I opened it and the password screen came up. I tried Sophie's birthday and it worked. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely move the mouse. I opened his email and started scrolling. There were hundreds of emails from my sister. Hundreds. I clicked on the oldest one I could find and the date made me feel sick. 4 months ago. Way before the dinner my mother mentioned. Way before I knew they were even working together regularly. The first email was about a patient case, but it was friendly, casual. My sister made a joke and James responded with a joke back. I kept scrolling forward and watching the emails get more frequent, more personal. They weren't talking about work anymore. They were talking about their days, their frustrations, their dreams. My sister sent him an email at 11 at night about feeling tired of always being alone. James responded at midnight saying he understood, that sometimes he felt alone too, even though he was married. I had to close the laptop and walk away. I went to the bathroom and threw up. When I came back, I made myself keep reading. There were inside jokes I didn't understand, references to conversations they'd had that I knew nothing about. My sister sent him a photo of herself at a conference last month, and he said she looked great. I printed everything, every single email. The printer ran for 20 minutes. I found our phone bill in James's desk drawer and opened it. The call log went on for pages. My sister's number showed up dozens of times every day. Some calls were short, just a minute or two. Others were 30 minutes, 40 minutes. There were texts at 2 in the morning. Texts at 6 in the morning. Texts during times when James told me he was in surgery. I counted the texts from one day last week. 47 texts back and forth between them. 47. On a day when James came home and barely said 10 words to me because he was so tired. I printed the phone bill too. My hands weren't shaking anymore. I felt cold and calm and clear. I organized all the papers into neat stacks on the kitchen table, emails in one pile, phone records in another. I made coffee and sat down to wait. James came home at 7. He walked in calling my name and asking what was for dinner. I was sitting at the kitchen table with all the papers spread out in front of me. He stopped in the doorway when he saw them. His face went white. He asked what I was doing, and I told him I went through his laptop. He stood there staring at the papers, and I watched his expression change from shock to anger. He said I had no right to go through his private things, that he couldn't believe I'd violate his privacy like that. I picked up the stack of emails and held them up. I asked him if he wanted to talk about privacy, or if he wanted to talk about the 4 months of constant communication with my sister that he never mentioned. He said those were work emails, and I laughed. It came out mean and sharp. I read one out loud, the one where my sister said she felt alone and he said he felt alone too. I asked him if that was about work. He said I was taking it out of context. I showed him the phone bill. I asked him to explain the 2 a.m. texts, the 47 texts in one day, the 30-minute phone calls during his lunch breaks. He said they were friends, that they worked together, that it was normal for colleagues to communicate. I asked him if it was normal to hide it from his wife. He didn't have an answer for that. We fought for 2 hours. It was the worst fight we'd ever had. Sophie was asleep upstairs and we were in the kitchen screaming at each other in whispers. I asked him if he was having an affair. He said no, they were just colleagues and friends. I asked him why he never mentioned being friends with my sister. He said he knew I'd overreact. I asked him if he had feelings for her. He said no. I asked him again. He said it was complicated. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. He started talking fast, saying that he and my sister understood each other, that they spoke the same language, that it was nice to talk to someone who got the pressures of his job. He said I didn't understand what it was like to be a surgeon, to have that kind of responsibility. He said my sister got it because she lived it too. Every word felt like he was saying I wasn't enough. I asked him if he wished he'd married her instead. He said that wasn't fair. I asked him again. He said sometimes he wondered what it would be like to be with someone who understood his world. I started crying and he reached for me, but I stepped back. I told him he needed to decide what he wanted because he couldn't have both. He said he wanted our marriage, but he also valued his friendship with my sister. I told him that wasn't friendship. That was emotional cheating. He got angry then and said I was being dramatic, that nothing physical happened. I said emotional affairs were still affairs. He said I was overreacting just like he knew I would. James slept in the guest room. I heard him walk down the hall around midnight and close the door. I lay in our bed staring at the ceiling. The sheets smelled like his cologne and I wanted to rip them off and burn them. I kept replaying the fight in my head, the way he said my sister understood him, the way he admitted to wondering what it would be like to be with her, the way he got angry at me for finding out instead of being sorry for lying. I didn't sleep at all. I watched the clock change from midnight to 1 to 2 to 3. At 6, I heard Sophie's door open and her little feet in the hallway. She came into my room and climbed into bed asking where Daddy was. I told her he had to sleep in the other room because he wasn't feeling well. She asked why he didn't have breakfast with us. I carried her downstairs and made her pancakes and told her Daddy had to go to work early. She ate her pancakes and talked about her dolls and didn't notice that I was crying while I poured her orange juice. I texted Alyssa and told her I needed help. She texted back immediately saying she was coming over after school. I got Sophie dressed and dropped her at preschool and sat in my car in the parking lot trying to figure out what to do next. I went to the school and sat through the staff meeting that afternoon without hearing a single word. Verity was talking about standardized testing schedules, and I was staring at the table thinking about James sleeping in the guest room and my sister wanting to steal my husband. Someone asked me a question about parent conferences and I had no idea what they'd said. Verity looked at me for a long moment and then moved on to the next topic. After the meeting, she touched my arm and asked me to come to her office. I followed her down the hallway and she closed the door behind us and told me to sit down. She asked if I was okay and I started crying. Not quiet tears, but the ugly kind where you can't breathe right and your nose runs everywhere. I told her everything. About my mother's phone call and the suggestion I should divorce James. About finding the emails and texts between James and my sister. About the Boston conference he registered for without telling me. About the fight last night and him sleeping in the guest room. Verity handed me tissues and listened to all of it without interrupting once. When I finished, she said I could take whatever time off I needed. She said she'd cover my class herself if necessary or get a substitute. She said my job would be here when I was ready to come back. I told her I needed to work because sitting at home thinking about it would make me crazy. She nodded and said that was fine too, but the offer stood whenever I needed it. I left school early anyway and drove to my mother's house. I didn't call first. Sophie was still at preschool for another 2 hours, and I needed to do this without her there. My mother was in her garden wearing the same clothes as before, like she'd been standing there all week. She looked up when I came through the gate and smiled like she was happy to see me. I asked her about the lawyer. She kept pruning her roses and said she'd talked to someone who handled family law. I asked why she thought it was okay to discuss my marriage with a lawyer without my permission. She said someone needed to be practical about the situation. She said she was trying to help everyone find their optimal life paths. Those exact words. Optimal life paths. Like we were all pieces on a chessboard she was moving around to get the best outcome. I asked her what my optimal life path was according to her planning. She said I could find someone more suitable to my educational level. Someone who didn't need a partner who understood cardiovascular surgery. Someone who'd be home for dinner and school events. She made it sound like she was doing me a favor by breaking up my marriage. I told her if she kept pushing this agenda, she wouldn't have a relationship with me or Sophie. She laughed. Actually laughed like I'd told a joke. She said I was being dramatic and that I'd come around when I saw how much happier everyone could be. She said Victoria and James could do amazing things together, and that I was being selfish by holding him back from his full potential. She said Sophie would adjust and that kids were flexible. She said in a few years I'd thank her for helping me see clearly. I turned around and walked back to my car without saying anything else. There was no point. She'd already decided how everything should go, and nothing I said would change her mind. My sister called that evening after I'd put Sophie to bed. I almost didn't answer, but then I thought maybe I needed to hear what she had to say. She started talking immediately about how she wanted to explain her perspective. She said she understood this was hard for me, but that I needed to look at the situation logically. She said she and James were intellectual equals, and that they understood each other in ways I couldn't understand him. She said I was just a teacher. Those words exactly. Just a teacher. Like my master's degree and my career meant nothing. Like teaching fourth graders was something anyone could do. She said James needed someone who could match his intellect and his ambition. Someone who lived in his world. She said I'd married him when he was a resident and didn't know he'd become this brilliant surgeon. She said it wasn't my fault that we weren't compatible anymore, but that I needed to face reality. Then she told me that she and James had talked about what their life together could look like. They'd discussed it. Multiple times. She described conversations about where they'd live and how they'd manage their schedules and what their research could accomplish together. She said they'd talked about having kids, and what kind of genetic advantages those kids would have with two cardiovascular surgeons as parents. She said all of this like it was perfectly normal to plan a future with someone else's husband. Like I should understand and agree that it made sense. I was recording the conversation on my phone. Nathan had told me to document everything, and I'd set up the recording app before I answered her call. I let her keep talking. I asked questions that made her explain more. I got her to say clearly that she and James had discussed being together, that they'd imagined a whole life, that they'd talked about it multiple times over the past few months. James came home late from the hospital around 10. I was sitting in the living room waiting for him. I didn't say hello. I just pulled up the recording on my phone and hit play. His face went white when he heard my sister's voice. He tried to interrupt, but I told him to listen to the whole thing. He sat down on the couch and listened to his sister describe their conversations about a future together, about the life they'd planned, about the children they'd discussed having. When it ended, he sat there staring at the floor. I asked him if it was true. He said they'd talked hypothetically. He said nothing physical had happened. He said it was just conversation and fantasy and that it didn't mean anything. I told him emotional affairs were still affairs. He looked at me and I could see that he knew I was right. He said he was sorry. He said he didn't mean for it to go this far. He said he valued his friendship with my sister, but that he loved me and wanted our marriage. I asked him how he could say he loved me when he'd been planning a whole different life with someone else. I told him he needed to decide what he wanted. He couldn't keep our marriage while having this close emotional relationship with my sister. He had to pick one. He asked for time to think about it. That hurt worse than anything else he'd said all night. The fact that he needed time to decide between me and my sister. The fact that it wasn't an immediate choice. He saw my face and tried to backtrack, but the damage was done. He'd already shown me that I wasn't enough. That our 5 years together and our daughter weren't enough to make the choice obvious. I told him to sleep in the guest room again. He left the living room and I sat there alone listening to him walk down the hallway and close the door. The next morning, I woke up on the couch where I'd fallen asleep around 3. Sophie was already awake, sitting on the floor with her stuffed animals, and I could hear James moving around upstairs getting ready for work. He left without saying goodbye. I heard the front door close and his car pull out of the driveway. Sophie looked up at me and asked where Daddy went. I told her he had to go to the hospital early. She went back to playing with her toys and I sat there staring at nothing. My phone rang around 8. It was Alyssa. She asked how I was doing and I started crying before I could answer. She told me to pack a bag for me and Sophie and come stay with them for a few days. I tried to say no, that I didn't want to impose, but she cut me off. She said Nathan already made up the spare room and Sophie would love having a sleepover with Auntie Alyssa. I packed 2 bags while Sophie ate breakfast. I threw in clothes and toys and Sophie's favorite blanket. We drove to Alyssa's house and Sophie was so excited she bounced in her car seat the whole way. Alyssa met us at the door and hugged me for a long time. Nathan took our bags upstairs and Sophie ran after him asking if she could see her room. Alyssa made me sit down at the kitchen table and put tea in front of me. She asked what happened after we talked on the phone last night. I told her about playing the recording for James, about him admitting they'd talked about a future together, about him asking for time to decide between me and my sister. She looked mad in a way I'd never seen before. She said James was out of his mind if he thought he needed time to choose his wife and daughter. Nathan came back downstairs and sat with us. He listened to everything and then said something that stuck with me. He said emotional affairs often feel more intense than physical ones because they're built on the fantasy of what could be, rather than the reality of what is. He said James and my sister had created this perfect imaginary relationship without any of the hard parts of real life, without sick kids or money stress or whose turn it is to do dishes. They got to have deep conversations about work and feel understood without actually building a life together. That made sense to me in a way nothing else had. The next day, Alyssa watched Sophie while I met with a lawyer Nathan recommended. The lawyer's office was in a tall building downtown, and I felt sick walking in. The lawyer was a woman around 50 with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She asked me to explain the situation, and I told her everything. About my mother's suggestion, my sister's feelings, the emails and texts, James's emotional affair, the Boston conference. She took notes and nodded and didn't look shocked by any of it. Then she started explaining what divorce would actually look like. She talked about custody arrangements and how courts decide what's best for kids Sophie's age. She explained asset division and how we'd split the house and savings and retirement accounts. She walked me through the whole process step by step. Filing papers, temporary orders, discovery, mediation, trial if we couldn't agree. It felt overwhelming and way too real. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. She said in our state, given Sophie's age and James's work schedule, I'd almost certainly get primary custody. Maybe 65 or 70% of the time. James would probably get every other weekend and one evening a week, maybe more during summer and holidays. But the bulk of Sophie's time would be with me. I sat there trying to process that. The idea of Sophie not seeing her dad most days, of her growing up in a split home, of having to coordinate schedules and handoffs and holidays, it made divorce suddenly feel very real and very scary. Not just an idea or a threat, but an actual thing that would happen and change everything. I thanked the lawyer and told her I needed to think about next steps. She gave me her card and said to call when I was ready. I drove back to Alyssa's house and sat in the driveway for 10 minutes before I could go inside. My phone started buzzing that afternoon. James was texting me. He said he needed to talk, that he'd made a decision, that we needed to discuss our future. I didn't respond. He texted again an hour later, then again before bed. The next morning he called twice and left voicemails. I listened to them but didn't call back. He sounded stressed and said this was important and we couldn't leave things like this. I still didn't respond. Alyssa asked if I was okay ignoring him, and I said I needed time to prepare myself for whatever he was going to say. I needed to be ready to hear that he chose my sister. Or that he chose me but didn't really mean it. I needed 2 days to build up whatever strength I'd need for that conversation. On the second day, I finally texted him back. I said we could meet tomorrow at the coffee shop on Maple Street at 10 in the morning. No Sophie, just us. He responded immediately saying he'd be there. I dropped Sophie off at Alyssa's house the next morning and drove to the coffee shop. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. James was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee. He'd ordered my usual. I sat down across from him and waited. He started talking immediately. He said he wanted to stay married, that he'd been stupid and got caught up in the attention and validation from my sister, that she made him feel important and understood in ways he hadn't felt in a long time, but that he realized what he was risking. Our family, our daughter, 5 years together. He said he loved me and wanted to make our marriage work. I listened to all of it and felt nothing. No relief or happiness or even anger. Just empty. I asked him what that would actually look like. He said we could go to counseling and work on communication and rebuild trust. I nodded and then I told him what I needed. I said wanting to stay married wasn't enough. He needed to completely cut off all non-professional contact with my sister. No texts about anything except work, no dinners or drinks or conferences together, and he needed to skip the Boston conference next weekend. And we needed to start marriage counseling immediately. He hesitated. It was just a second, but I saw it. His face changed when I mentioned Boston. He said that was a really important conference for his career, that he was presenting research he'd worked on for months, that skipping it would look bad professionally. I felt something cold settle in my chest. I said he could maintain appropriate boundaries with my sister at the conference, that they'd barely see each other with different sessions and presentations, that I was being unreasonable asking him to skip a major career opportunity. I looked at him and said very clearly that if he got on a plane to Boston next weekend, I would file for divorce while he was gone, that this was his choice, our marriage or that conference. He stared at me like I'd slapped him. He said I was making him choose between his career and his family. I said no. I was making him choose between his career and an emotional affair with my sister. There was a difference. He argued for 20 minutes. About his professional reputation. About the months of work that went into his presentation. About how I was being controlling and unreasonable. About how he could handle being around my sister appropriately. I just kept saying the same thing. Boston or our marriage. Pick one. He picked Boston. He actually sat there in that coffee shop and told me he was going to the conference. That this was too important for his career. That I was being unfair making him choose. That he'd prove he could maintain boundaries with my sister and then we could move forward with counseling. I stood up and walked out. I heard him calling after me, but I didn't stop. I got in my car and drove back to Alyssa's house. Nathan was there when I arrived, and he took one look at my face and knew. I told them James chose Boston. Alyssa said some very creative things about my husband that I won't repeat. Nathan just looked sad. He said sometimes people show you who they are and you have to believe them. James left for Boston on Friday morning. I'd moved back home by then because I couldn't hide at Alyssa's forever. Sophie and I had the house to ourselves for the weekend. We did normal mother-daughter things. We baked chocolate chip cookies on Friday afternoon, and Sophie got flour everywhere. We went to the park on Saturday and she played on the swings for an hour. We had a tea party with her stuffed animals on Sunday morning. I tried so hard not to cry in front of her. Every time I felt tears coming, I'd go to the bathroom or turn away. But at night after she was asleep, I'd sit on the couch and let myself fall apart. My marriage was ending. My husband had chosen a conference over us, and I had no idea what came next. Sunday evening, I made the mistake of checking social media. My sister had posted photos from the conference, professional shots of panels and presentations, but there were several with James in them, standing together at a reception, sitting next to each other at a dinner with other surgeons, smiling in a group photo with conference badges. They weren't touching or doing anything wrong, but the way they stood next to each other made my stomach hurt. They looked comfortable together, natural, like they belonged in the same frame. I closed the app and put my phone face down on the table. Sophie came running in asking if we could watch a movie before bed. I said yes, and we curled up on the couch with her favorite blanket. She fell asleep halfway through and I carried her up to bed. Then I came back downstairs and sat in the dark living room thinking about lawyers and custody arrangements and how to tell a 3-year-old that her family was breaking apart. I texted Alyssa around 8 that night after Sophie finally went down. She showed up 40 minutes later with 2 bottles of wine and her laptop under her arm. We sat on my couch in the dark living room with just the lamp on and pulled up my sister's social media. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The first few posts were standard conference stuff, panels and presentations and name tags. Then we got to the dinner photos. There was one where all the surgeons were seated at a long table and my sister and James were right next to each other. Not across from each other or separated by other people, right next to each other like they'd planned it that way. They were both smiling at something someone said and their shoulders were almost touching. Alyssa zoomed in on the photo and we just stared at it for a minute. There was another photo from what looked like a hotel bar with a group of doctors holding drinks. My sister and James were standing together again. His hand wasn't on her or anything, but they looked comfortable, natural, like they belonged in the same space. Alyssa closed the laptop and poured us both more wine. We didn't talk much after that. Just sat there drinking and watching stupid reality TV until she left around midnight. James came home Monday evening around 6:30. I heard his car in the driveway and my whole body went cold. Sophie ran to the door yelling for him and he picked her up and spun her around like everything was normal. He came into the kitchen carrying her and started telling me about his presentation before he even set down his bag. How well it went. How many people came up to him afterward with questions. How the moderator said it was one of the best talks of the conference. I just stood there at the counter chopping vegetables for dinner and didn't say anything. He kept talking. About the other presentations he saw. About the networking opportunities. About how valuable the whole experience was for his career. Sophie wiggled down and went back to her toys in the living room. James finally stopped talking and looked at me. Really looked at me. I put down the knife and turned to face him. I asked him straight out if anything happened with my sister in Boston. He got very still and quiet. Then he shook his head and said nothing physical happened. Nothing physical. Those were his exact words. I asked what that meant and he said they had dinner together a few times. That they talked about the situation. About everything that was happening. I asked how many times was a few and he said 3 nights. They had dinner together 3 nights out of the 4 nights he was there. I asked what they talked about for 3 whole dinners and he looked away. Said they discussed their feelings. Their situation. What it all meant. Then he told me that my sister confessed her feelings for him directly on the last night. That she told him she thought they should be together, that she believed they were better suited than we were. And he didn't shut it down. He didn't tell her to stop, or that it was inappropriate, or that he was married and not interested. He let her talk. He sat there and listened while she laid out her vision of their future together, what their life could look like, what their children could be. He told her he needed to think about everything. Those were his words. That he needed to think about everything. Like our marriage was something he had to consider and weigh and decide about. I told him to pack a bag and leave. He just stared at me like I'd spoken another language. He started saying we should talk about this, that we should sit down and have a real conversation, that he knew he'd made mistakes, but we could work through this. I said I was done talking, that he went to Boston despite my ultimatum, that he had dinner with my sister 3 times, that he listened to her confession and told her he'd think about it instead of ending it immediately, that there was nothing left to talk about. He tried to argue, said I was being unreasonable, that nothing physical happened so it shouldn't count as cheating, that he was confused and overwhelmed and needed time to process everything. I just kept saying the same thing. Pack a bag and leave. Pack a bag and leave. Sophie came running in asking what was wrong and I had to paste on a smile and tell her everything was fine. James looked at her and then at me and his face just crumpled. But he went upstairs and I heard him moving around in our bedroom. He came back down 20 minutes later with a duffel bag. He kissed Sophie goodbye and told her he loved her. Then he walked out the front door. The next morning I had to get Sophie ready for preschool by myself. Make breakfast by myself. Do the dishes by myself, pack her lunch by myself, drive her to the school by myself, come home to an empty house by myself. I called in sick to work because I couldn't face my classroom, couldn't face Alyssa's worried looks, or Verity asking if I was okay. I just sat on the couch and stared at the wall. Sophie's preschool called around noon to say she was asking for her daddy, and could someone come talk to her. I drove over there and found her crying in the reading corner. The teacher said she'd been fine all morning, but suddenly got upset during story time. I sat with Sophie in my lap and told her daddy was staying somewhere else for a little while, but he still loved her very much. She asked when he was coming home, and I said I didn't know. She cried harder, and I held her until she fell asleep against my chest. My mother called that afternoon, said she heard James moved out, said she wanted to discuss next steps. I asked what next steps she thought there were, and she started talking about divorce lawyers and custody arrangements and how to make this transition smooth for everyone. I told her there were no next steps involving her, that she wasn't welcome in my home anymore, that she wasn't allowed around Sophie until further notice. She laughed and said I was being dramatic, that I'd change my mind once I calmed down. I hung up on her. She called back 5 times and I didn't answer. The next day I went back to work because I couldn't hide forever. I made it through the morning okay. My students were working on a math project, and I could just walk around helping them without having to actually teach. Then lunch break came and I went to the teacher's lounge to eat. I was sitting at a table by myself when someone knocked on the door. One of the office staff stuck her head in and said I had a visitor. I walked out to the main office and there was my mother, standing right there in the school lobby like she had every right to be there. She started talking immediately about how we needed to discuss this properly, about how I was making things harder than they needed to be, about how she was just trying to help everyone find their best path forward. Verity came out of her office and saw what was happening. She walked right up to my mother and asked who she was. My mother introduced herself and Verity's face went hard. She called security and told them to escort my mother off campus. My mother started arguing, but Verity cut her off, said she wasn't welcome there, that if she came back, she'd be arrested for trespassing. The security guard took my mother's arm and walked her toward the exit. She was still talking as they pushed through the doors, still trying to explain her side. Verity put her hand on my shoulder and asked if I was okay. I nodded, even though I wasn't. I found Jillian Porter's name through my insurance website that night. She specialized in betrayal trauma and family dysfunction. I called and got an appointment for the next week. When I showed up to her office, she was younger than I expected. Maybe mid-30s with kind eyes and a calm voice. I told her everything. About my mother's phone call. About James and my sister. About Boston and the confession and James moving out. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something that made me start crying. She said this pattern of manipulation had probably been happening my whole life. That this situation with James was just the most extreme version of something that had been going on for years. That my mother had been comparing me to my sister, and making me feel less than for as long as I could remember. We spent the next session going through my childhood memories. All the times my mother praised my sister's grades and glossed over mine. All the times she talked about my sister's career potential while dismissing my interest in teaching. All the times she made me feel like I wasn't smart enough or successful enough or valuable enough. I'd always known my mother favored my sister, but I'd never connected it to a larger pattern. Never understood that it was manipulation. That it was designed to keep me feeling inferior and grateful for whatever scraps of approval she threw my way. Jillian said my mother had always compared me unfavorably to my sister. Had always made me feel like my teaching career was less valuable than my sister's medical career. This situation with James was just the most extreme version of a lifelong pattern of making me feel like I didn't deserve what I had. I understood that my mother's manipulation wasn't new. It had been there my entire life in smaller ways. The constant comparisons, the dismissive comments about my career, the way she lit up when talking about my sister's achievements and barely acknowledged mine. Jillian helped me see that this situation with James was just the biggest and most obvious version of something that had been happening for decades. 2 weeks after James moved out, his lawyer contacted mine about setting up a formal meeting to discuss custody and next steps. We scheduled it for a Thursday afternoon at my lawyer's office downtown. I took a personal day from the school and dropped Sophie at Alyssa's house beforehand. The office was on the 15th floor of a glass building with views of the city. James was already there when I arrived, sitting in the conference room with his lawyer. He looked tired. His hair was messy like he'd been running his hands through it, and his shirt was wrinkled. My lawyer sat next to me and opened a folder full of documents. James's lawyer started talking about parenting time and schedules. I watched James while they talked and realized I was sitting across a table from my husband with lawyers between us, negotiating how to split up our daughter's life. It felt completely unreal. Like I was watching it happen to someone else. The mediation lasted 3 hours. We went through calendars and work schedules and holiday arrangements. James's lawyer kept emphasizing his demanding work hours and unpredictable surgery schedule. My lawyer pointed out that I had stable hours, and Sophie was already comfortable with her routine at home. Halfway through, James interrupted the lawyer's talking and looked directly at me for the first time since I'd arrived. He said he needed to be honest about something, that he'd been unhappy in our marriage for over a year, that he felt like we didn't have enough in common intellectually, and he'd been feeling disconnected for a long time. His lawyer looked annoyed that he was going off script, but James kept talking. He said working with my sister made him realize what it felt like to connect with someone on that level, to have conversations that challenged him, to be with someone who understood the pressures of his career. It hurt hearing him say it out loud, but at least it was honest in a way he hadn't been before. I waited until he finished, and then I told him that his unhappiness didn't excuse what he did. That if he was unhappy, he should have talked to me about it. Should have suggested marriage counseling or told me he was struggling instead of developing an emotional affair with my sister. That his feelings didn't justify pursuing my sister while we were still married. That there were ways to handle unhappiness that didn't involve betraying your spouse. James looked down at his hands and didn't argue. His lawyer tried to redirect the conversation back to custody, but I wasn't done. I said that he made a choice to confide in my sister instead of his wife, to share his feelings and frustrations with her instead of working on our marriage, that those were active choices he made every single day for months. We finally agreed on a temporary custody arrangement. Sophie would stay primarily with me at the house, and James would have her every other weekend plus one evening during the week for dinner. James's face changed when his lawyer wrote down every other weekend, like it was just hitting him how little time that actually was. He started to argue that he wanted more time, but his lawyer quietly reminded him about his surgery schedule and on-call rotations. The reality was that his work made more time impossible. He couldn't commit to regular weekday mornings or evenings. He couldn't guarantee he'd be available for pickup or drop-off. The schedule we agreed to was actually the most he could realistically manage given his job. I watched him realize this, and something in his expression broke. But he signed the temporary agreement anyway. My sister started trying to contact me the next day. She called 4 times before noon. I didn't answer. Then she started texting. Long messages about how she wanted to clear the air, how we needed to talk about everything like adults, how she was sorry I was hurt but she couldn't help her feelings, how she and James had something special and real. I read the first few messages and then stopped opening them. I called my phone company and blocked her number completely. Then I blocked her on every social media platform I had. I sent an email to my extended family saying that I wasn't interested in any communication with my sister and asked them to respect that boundary. I didn't explain why. I didn't need to. Everyone already knew what was happening. Some family members responded right away with support. Others didn't respond at all. My cousin sent me a message 3 days later saying I was being stubborn, that these things happen and I should be mature enough to accept it, that my sister and James were clearly better suited, and I was making everything harder by being difficult. My uncle called to say essentially the same thing, that I should think about what was best for Sophie, and maybe that meant accepting this new arrangement gracefully. I realized my mother had been talking to everyone, spinning the story to make my sister and James look like they couldn't help falling for each other, like they were star-crossed lovers instead of 2 people who betrayed me. She was rewriting the narrative to make me the villain for not stepping aside. But other family members reached out with genuine support. My aunt on my father's side called and told me something I hadn't known. She said my mother tried this same kind of manipulation with her daughters years ago, that she'd tried to convince my aunt's younger daughter that she should date her older sister's boyfriend because they had more in common, that my mother had a pattern of trying to rearrange people's lives like chess pieces to create what she thought were optimal pairings. My aunt said she'd cut contact with my mother for 2 years because of it, that I wasn't the first person my mother had done this to, and I probably wouldn't be the last. It helped knowing I wasn't crazy, that this wasn't normal mother behavior. I threw myself into my classroom. My 4th graders were working on a unit about family diversity and different family structures. We read books about single-parent families and blended families and families with 2 moms or 2 dads. We talked about how families come in all different shapes, and how love is what makes a family, not a specific structure. I watched my students absorb these ideas without judgment, and realized there were many different ways to build a good life. That the traditional family structure I'd been trying to maintain wasn't the only valid option. That Sophie and I could be happy in whatever form our family took. 6 weeks after James moved out, Alyssa came over after Sophie went to bed. She had wine and a serious expression. She sat down on my couch and said she needed to tell me something before I found out another way. That she'd heard from a mutual friend who worked at the hospital that James and my sister were dating officially. That they'd been seen having dinner together multiple times. That people at the hospital were talking about it. I felt my chest get tight, but I wasn't surprised. Part of me had been waiting for this. Alyssa pulled out her phone and showed me my sister's social media. She'd unblocked me temporarily so I could see. There were photos from the past 2 weeks. My sister at restaurants, my sister at a park. And in several of them, if you looked carefully at the background or the reflections, you could see James. The fact that they were dating so quickly after our separation confirmed everything. Their emotional affair had been deeper than James admitted. They didn't need time to develop feelings because those feelings were already fully formed. They'd been building a relationship for months while James was still living in my house, while he was still sleeping in my bed, while he was still kissing me goodbye every morning. They'd just been waiting for the right moment to make it official. The betrayal of it settled into my bones. Not the sharp pain of discovery, but the deep ache of confirmed suspicion. I'd been right about everything, and somehow that made it worse. I called my lawyer the next morning and told her I wanted to file for divorce. She'd been expecting my call after our initial consultation, and had already started preparing the paperwork. We met at her office that afternoon while Sophie was at preschool. She walked me through everything, explaining custody arrangements and asset division, and how we'd protect Sophie's stability through all of this. James's demanding surgery schedule actually worked in my favor because the court would see that primary custody with me made sense. My lawyer was sharp and thorough, asking questions about James's income and our shared assets, and whether I had documentation of his relationship with my sister. I showed her the emails I'd printed and the recording of my sister's confession. She nodded and made notes and told me we had a strong case. The divorce papers were filed by the end of the week. James got served at the hospital, which probably embarrassed him in front of his colleagues, but I couldn't bring myself to care about that anymore. Sophie asked why Daddy wasn't coming home anymore. I sat with her on her bedroom floor surrounded by her stuffed animals and tried to explain in words a 3-year-old could understand. Sometimes grown-ups who love each other can't stay married, I told her. It doesn't mean we don't love you. We both love you so much. She asked if it was her fault and my chest hurt. No, baby, I said. This is about Mommy and Daddy, not about you. You didn't do anything wrong. She seemed to accept this better than I expected, though she had moments where she'd cry for her daddy or ask when our family would be together again. Those moments gutted me every time. But mostly she adjusted to the new routine of staying with me during the week and seeing James every other weekend. Kids are tougher than we give them credit for. My mother showed up at my house 3 weeks after I filed for divorce. I saw her car pull up through the living room window and my whole body went tense. She had my sister with her. They walked up to my front door like they had every right to be there. I didn't answer when they knocked. My mother called through the door that they needed to talk to me about my stubbornness, that I was making a mistake and they were here to help me see reason. An intervention, she called it. Like I was the one with the problem. I pulled out my phone and called the police. My mother kept knocking and talking through the door about how I was being unfair to everyone, how James and my sister deserved happiness, how I should think about what's best for Sophie instead of being selfish. I stood in my hallway with the phone to my ear telling the dispatcher that my mother and sister were on my property refusing to leave after I'd told them they weren't welcome. The police arrived within 15 minutes. My mother acted shocked when the officers asked her to leave. She tried to explain to them that she was just trying to talk to her daughter about a family matter. The officers didn't care. They escorted both her and my sister off my property and warned them about trespassing. I went back to my lawyer the next day and asked about a restraining order. My mother had been calling and texting constantly despite me blocking her number. She'd started showing up at my school until Verity had security remove her. She'd even tried to pick Sophie up from preschool, telling the staff she was taking her granddaughter for the afternoon. The preschool called me immediately and didn't release Sophie, but it scared me. My lawyer filed for the restraining order that afternoon. We had the recording of my sister's confession about pursuing James. We had documentation of my mother's harassment. We had the police report from the trespassing incident. The judge granted the restraining order at the hearing 2 weeks later. My mother tried to argue that she was just concerned about her family, but the judge wasn't interested. He looked at the evidence and granted the order immediately, requiring my mother to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my home, and my workplace. I started seeing Nathan for therapy sessions to process everything with my family. Alyssa had offered to let her husband work with me at a reduced rate, and I accepted because I needed professional help understanding how my family had become so broken. Nathan explained that going no contact with family members is sometimes the only healthy choice when they refuse to respect boundaries. He helped me see that my mother's behavior wasn't normal or acceptable, that her trying to arrange my divorce so my sister could have my husband was deeply wrong, that the way she'd always compared me unfavorably to my sister and devalued my teaching career was emotional abuse. I cried in his office talking about the mother I'd wished I had, the one who would have been proud of my career and protective of my marriage. Nathan told me to grieve that mother because she never existed. The real mother I had was the one who valued status over her daughter's happiness. Accepting that reality hurt worse than the divorce. 3 months after James moved out, I woke up one Saturday morning and realized I felt okay. Not happy exactly, but stable. My life had gotten smaller in some ways without James and without my mother and sister, but it felt real. It felt like mine. Sophie and I had our routines now. Saturday morning pancakes that we made together with chocolate chips. Trips to the library every Tuesday after school. Movie nights on Fridays with popcorn and her favorite animated films. My house was quieter without James's late-night phone calls about surgeries and early morning alarms, but it was peaceful in a way it hadn't been for years. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop anymore. I wasn't wondering if my husband was texting my sister. I was just living my life with my daughter, and that was enough. Verity called me into her office one Monday after school and told me she wanted to offer me an opportunity. The district was starting a new teaching initiative focused on literacy development, and they needed someone to lead the elementary school portion. She'd recommended me based on my expertise and dedication. The position came with a small raise and would involve training other teachers and developing curriculum. I accepted immediately. It felt good to have my professional skills recognized and valued. My family had never understood that teaching was important work, that shaping young minds and helping kids learn to read and think critically mattered. But Verity understood. My colleagues understood. And now I was getting the chance to expand my impact beyond just my own classroom. I started a support group for teachers going through divorce. We met twice a month at the community center near my house. There were 7 of us at the first meeting, all educators dealing with the end of their marriages while trying to maintain composure in front of their students. We shared stories and resources and just listened to each other without judgment. Helping others navigate what I'd been through gave me purpose. It helped me see my own journey with more perspective. I wasn't the only person whose marriage had fallen apart. I wasn't the only one rebuilding their life from scratch. We were all doing it together, supporting each other through the hard parts. Alyssa called me 4 months after James and I separated to tell me she'd heard through hospital connections that James and my sister were engaged. 4 months of dating and they were already planning a wedding. It confirmed what I'd known all along. They'd been more involved than James ever admitted. Those feelings were already fully formed before he even moved out of our house. They'd just been waiting for the right time to make it official. Some of our extended family members were uncomfortable with how fast they'd moved, Alyssa said. But my mother was thrilled and already planning their wedding. Of course she was. This was exactly what she'd wanted from the beginning. Her 2 successful surgeons getting married and producing genetically superior children. I felt nothing when Alyssa told me. No anger, no sadness, just a distant sense that this was happening to someone else's ex-husband and sister. I focused on building a life that looked like what I actually valued instead of what my family thought I should value. Sophie and I created new traditions. We planted a small vegetable garden in the backyard, and she helped me water it every evening. We started having dinner with Alyssa and Nathan and their kids every Sunday. We volunteered at the animal shelter on Saturday afternoons, walking dogs and socializing cats. I decorated our house the way I wanted without worrying about James's opinions on furniture or paint colors. Sophie picked out new curtains for her room covered in stars and planets. We made our space feel like home in a way it never quite had when I was trying to maintain the perfect surgeon's wife household. This life was smaller and quieter, but it was authentic, and it was ours, and that mattered more than any fantasy about genetic potential or intellectual, equals my mother had tried to sell me. Alyssa and Nathan started showing up every week for dinner with their kids, and somewhere along the way, Sophie stopped calling them by their names and started saying Auntie Alyssa and Uncle Nathan instead. Nobody made a big deal about it or had some formal conversation. It just happened naturally because they were the ones who showed up consistently, who remembered Sophie's favorite foods and brought her little presents for no reason, and asked about her day at preschool like they genuinely cared about the answer. They came to her dance recital when James had to work late. They took her to the zoo on a Saturday when I had to finish report cards. They were there in all the small, regular ways that grandparents and aunts and uncles are supposed to be there, and Sophie felt safe with them in a way she never quite did with my mother or sister. I watched my daughter bloom with that kind of steady, reliable love from people who valued her for exactly who she was, instead of some idea of genetic potential. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning 6 months after James moved out. I sat in the courtroom wearing my favorite blue dress, and when the judge signed the papers, I felt this huge wave of relief wash over me instead of sadness. I was free from a marriage where I spent 5 years feeling like I wasn't smart enough, or accomplished enough, or interesting enough to be a real partner. James looked tired and sad across the courtroom, and I felt sorry for him in a distant way, but mostly I just felt grateful it was over. My lawyer walked me out afterward and congratulated me, and I realized she was right to do that, because this was something to celebrate even if it didn't feel traditional to think of divorce as a good thing. I bought a smaller house 3 months after the divorce was final. It was a cute little 2-bedroom place with a big backyard and enough room for me and Sophie without feeling empty. James helped with the down payment as part of our settlement, which was fair since he made so much more money than I did. I spent weeks decorating it exactly how I wanted without worrying about whether James would think my choices were tasteful or sophisticated enough. I painted Sophie's room lavender because she loved purple. I set up a reading nook in the living room with a huge comfy chair and bookshelves covering one whole wall. I bought art supplies and set up a craft table where Sophie and I could make messes together without anyone getting upset about the house looking too cluttered. I hung my students' artwork on the refrigerator and put family photos on the mantle, but they were photos of me and Sophie and Alyssa's family and my teaching friends, not the formal family portraits my mother always insisted on. This house felt like home in a way our old house never quite did. 1 year after my mother's phone call, I woke up on a Tuesday morning and realized I was genuinely happy in ways I didn't even know were possible before. My teaching career was going great. The literacy program I was leading had expanded to 3 other elementary schools in the district, and Verity kept telling me I should consider becoming an administrator someday. Sophie was thriving in preschool, making friends easily, and showing the same love of learning I tried to encourage in my students. We had Sunday dinners with Alyssa and Nathan and their kids every single week without fail. We had our own little traditions and inside jokes and the kind of chosen family that shows up when things get hard. Some of my biological family members reached out occasionally, cousins and aunts who felt bad about how everything went down, and I was polite but distant with them. I learned that some family relationships just can't be salvaged, and that's okay. My mother and sister were married to James now, according to Alyssa, who still heard hospital gossip sometimes. I wished them well from far away while knowing I made exactly the right choice in walking away from all of that. My life wasn't what I planned when I married James 5 years ago, but it was real, and it was mine, and it was built on people who actually valued me for who I was. That mattered more than any fantasy about genetic potential or intellectual, equals my mother ever tried to sell me. That's how it played out for me. But I already know some of you have a totally different view. Share it in the comments, I'll be reading them later.